It's my pleasure to introduce Cordell Carter, and you'll see Cordell's bio. And Cordell is an alum of University of Washington, Seattle. He went on to study at Carnegie Mellon, and then he went on to get his law degree at University of Notre Dame. And you'll see all kinds of connections through the institutions that he studied at in his talk. Cordell is at the Aspen Institute, where he is the executive director of the Socrates Program. The Socrates Program has a methodology to engage people in civil discourse about critical issues of our time, and to also engage in leadership and bring about social change. So he talks a bit about that, and you can see that throughout his talk. I want you, students, to use the discussion board. I know some of you have been, but I want to encourage you to use the discussion board. And the two things that I'll say about the discussion board, especially given what Cordell is talking about, the range of issues that he's talking about, just be thoughtful and be inquisitive and engage each other in dialogue and discussion in a way that is consistent with how Cordell is talking about these issues. I have a couple of prompts for you that you might consider. One, what are the conditions for an inclusive republic? So for us to get to this notion of a truly inclusive republic, what are the conditions that you think are necessary to create an inclusive republic? That's number one. The second question I'd encourage you to think about is, what are signs of hope for an inclusive republic? So what are signs of hope that you see that we might become an inclusive republic? For me, for example, I'm at the university, and even during COVID, I look out and I think the university is a good example of a sign of hope for me that we can be an inclusive republic, invites community together to think together to make a better world. So what are signs that you see of hope for an inclusive republic? So thank you. Enjoy Cordell's lecture.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cordell Carter. I am a recovering attorney, loyal University of Washington graduate, class of 1998, and the leader of the Socrates Program for the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C. For the last 4 years, I've been engaged in a labor of love. Love for my country, for the United States of America. Love and hope, to be accurate. And it's called Becoming an Inclusive Republic. It's a text-based seminar, and we get it right now in bits and pieces, and I'm very honored to share it with you all. And so I want to talk about where it came from. I experienced the 2016 presidential elections from China. I was an Eisenhower Foundation Fellow, taking a much-needed break from my startup at the time, and wanted to learn more about this great emerging superpower in China, because I was certain that I knew how the election would turn out. So you sit on your absentee ballot and you go on and you hop on a long flight. Well, while I was in China, my colleagues that were meeting across 8 different cities kept telling me that the result of the election would be different than what I assumed. I assumed that the Democratic candidate would win because of who the Republican candidate was. And I was wrong. I was surprised. I was surprised on 2 counts, obviously by the result, and secondly, by the reaction to the result. And it reminded me of something I observed over the previous 15 years, which is there's a decided lack of civics education in the United States of America. We don't know how our laws work. We don't know where they come from. We are telling ourselves a story about our country that is inaccurate. And I think it leads to a lot of acrimony. It leads to frustration. And we're forgetting that there's a much bigger story at play. And that story is the evolutionary path of every nation state towards a better version of itself. And I believe we are on that path, this path to becoming an inclusive republic. We've evolved tremendously. We just have to block out the noise. Now, we're in interesting times with our very incredibly powerful social media platforms. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary A Social Dilemma, but our 2 million-year-old brains are no match for algorithms that can predict our biases, that can confirm those biases, and only feed us information that we want to hear. Civil discourse is not that, okay? Civil discourse is intentionally engaging people who don't believe what you believe, asking them, where does that belief come from? okay? Engaging them on something you hold in common, be it text, be it a location, whatever, but using something that you hold in common as a launch pad for deeper conversation that's done in a respectful way. So when I built this seminar, Becoming an Inclusive Republic, that is what I had in mind. I wanted to build something that most Americans could identify with and could easily attain. We are using material from our nation's beginning 244 years ago in Philadelphia, all the way to some bestsellers from the last couple of years that really speak to what people are experiencing all over America. And so as we begin this conversation slash lecture slash seminar, I would like to focus on 3 questions. Question number 1, who is we? Question number 2, how has we evolved? How has our notion of we evolved? And the 3rd question, where do we go from here? So let's start with the Declaration of Independence. Now, there's a good reason you have to start with any conversation about the constitutional republic known as the United States of America with the Declaration of Independence, namely because it was the very first document that declared the existence of the United States of America. So it's important to start there. But it also is our North Star. It expresses what we think about ourselves. All right? So any point in our history where we're failing, we point to a non-legal document, which is the Declaration of Independence. Now, it's commonly held as when our founders architected this nation, they blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's straight from I Have a Dream. And so what Martin Luther King was referring to was the Declaration of Independence. And so let's talk about July the 2nd, 1776, shall we? Because it leads us to our first question. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, as endowed by their Creator. There's a lot going on in those 2 lines. And it leads to the first question, who is we? Okay. And so when you say we hold, you're saying we agree. We agree that something is true, right? And then you end the line by saying self-evident. Self-evident has a religious connotation, okay? It means you have evidence that something is true without knowing that it is, okay? God created the trees. Why? Because they're so tall and men aren't that tall. So it's self-evident that he did it, right? Someone else had to do this thing. And so when they were declaring what was self-evident, something that had to be true by its very existence is what that means, they were creating the parameters of this thing called the United States. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable, meaning cannot be defeated, cannot be separated from you. All men, certain unalienable rights as endowed by their Creator. Okay? So here's the construct. Men equal unalienable rights from God. You see the revolution in that statement in 1776? Okay, let's get back there. We'll be there in a second. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay, these are fighting words in 1776. Why do you think these are fighting words? Okay, I'll tell you. They're fighting words because prior to that point, one became a king by might. Okay, the House of Norman, that still runs the United Kingdom. They won this in battle in 900 something, a long time ago. So the narrative that is created, because they were able to win this country in battle and the right to rule, it's ordained by the Creator himself. And he who is ordained and appointed by the Creator cannot be torn asunder. They decide what type of government us commoners will experience. They decide who of their most loyal men will become noblemen. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the men gathered in that room in Philadelphia in 1776 were noble men, meaning the King of England, King George, as we know from Hamilton, gave them the right to land. Do you know what the first word was instead of happiness? Benjamin Franklin prevailed upon the young Thomas Jefferson to change the word property to happiness because it was a synonym. You can't be happy if you don't have property. You don't have income if you don't have property. Okay? If you're not a blacksmith, if you're not a roofer, if you're not a bricklayer, how can you earn income? If you're a noble person, a noble man, the king gave you the right to income. All you had to do was clear those 20,000 acres in this place I have never seen, because I'm the king, of its current inhabitants, otherwise known as indigenous peoples. And so if you had the might to clear that land of its current inhabitants, it was yours. And then further, I'm going to give you the right to pay for labor once and import humans to serve your needs, to ensure that you earn income from that land. And as long as you pay your taxes, your duty to the king, God's appointed, everything's good. But what was the problem in 1776 that caused this revolution among the colonists? Well, the King of England was pursuing war against France. And wars are what? Expensive. Very expensive. Now, I'm not saying this wasn't an incredible event in 1776. It was. It most certainly was. It changed the history of Western democracies, without question. It created Western democracies. But it was also a perfectly timed event. Okay? When is the best time to fight someone? That's hard to beat. When they're fighting someone else. Okay? You ever seen a Kung Fu movie? Right? Why don't they ever just jump the guy at once? I've never understood why they wait. Okay? America wasn't waiting. These colonists said, this is the time to strike. I don't want to pay for this war. But since King George is going to engage in this war and profit from our labor, impinge upon our happiness, we're going to redetermine who is we. We don't have a high priest that cannot be attained. Okay? We are the high priest. I hear directly from the Creator. And the Creator told us to start our own thing. We don't need a king. We're going to create government. A government instituted by men. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the single most revolutionary thing that a colonist could say to a king. But America did it. As you know, with the help of the French, America prevailed. And so we have a young republic. Okay? We have a young republic of 13 colonies, about 15 million people. Everything is going swimmingly, except there was no tie that bound everyone together. You had 13 colonies, 13 different currencies, 13 different laws. It was a mess, okay? Absolute mess. Multiple languages being spoken. So there was these things called constitutional conventions. About 6 or 7 of them happened in the 13 years between 1776 and 1789, okay? You had great thinkers of the day. Again, more noble men, or aspiring to be noble men, like Alexander Hamilton, who was not a landed person, arguing for what type of government we should have, okay? A constitution, something that would bind us all together. Now, if you revert to Federalist Paper 10, James Madison, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, there were, I want to say 89. We know that Hamilton wrote most of them. But James Madison, he wrote some jewels, okay? And he expressed in Federalist 10 his grave concern against the faction versus the majority. By faction, he meant a group of folks, a small group of people with great passion that could change the order of things for the majority. Sound familiar? 1776? Okay, just checking. Okay. So James Madison was all for republic. He wanted a constitutional republic where individuals, passionate individuals, could not overturn what they just won. So essentially he was saying the faction that created this country was permissible because we were special, but no other factions can come behind us and recreate a country here because we've already done it. Okay, what's good for the goose is not good for the gander, with as far as James Madison was concerned. And so in 1789, we come up with a constitution. We know it as a document that's endured since 1789. Notice that we haven't had any significant changes. We do have amendments, and that's the process by which you change the constitution or add to. But for the most part, it's been pretty stable. Moreover, our Constitution has inspired more than 100 other constitutions around the world. So clearly, those enlightened men of the late 18th century were onto something, this thing called democracy. Even if it isn't a democracy in reality, those words, those democratic ideals have held true for a very long time. In fact, to the degree to which America fails, the standard that we hold ourselves against are the same words penned in the late 18th century. But the Constitution also clearly defined who was in and who was out. Okay? Our Constitution is a combination of the Massachusetts Plan and the Virginia Plan. Now, Massachusetts was very concerned that Virginia would be overrepresented because it had so many slaves, whereas Massachusetts was more industrial. And so we have these anti-democratic principles in our democratic documents. I know everyone is thinking about the Electoral College is fresh in mind, and it should be. But we also have 2 senators per state. Did you know that right now, right this very second, that 80% of America's population is represented by only 20 senators, and 20% of America's population is represented by 80 senators? That's probably not the founders' intent. What was also not the founders' intent was a country from sea to shining sea, but that's another topic. So the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution clearly lays out what America thought of people who were not white men, white propertied men. Now, we started this piece about around the question of who is we. This idea of, if the North Star says we hold these truths to be self-evident, and figuring out who the we is very important. And so from 1776 to, I would say, 1857, we knew what that answer was. So in the next part, we're going to talk about how our notion of we started to evolve. There were some cracks in this armor, if you will, for a variety of reasons, but cracks that large swaths of our population came pouring through. So I thank you all for listening to this first part. I will list below the readings that support some of these discussions, and please read them before you actually listen to this. That's probably the best way. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of Becoming an Inclusive Republic. And here we are talking about how has our notion of we evolved. But before we get there, I want to close part 1 of this who is we with a definitive answer. I said that period of only white property men being part of the we extended to 1857. And I want to refer to a case that solidifies that point. The Dred Scott case. This is Dred Scott versus Stanford in 1857 and went to the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a primary question asked. There were 2 primary questions. One is, did citizenship rights guaranteed by the Constitution apply to African Americans? And the second question is, could Congress prohibit slavery in new states? Now you see why this case, and especially answering that second question, is often said to have caused a civil war. So the citizenship question, the Taney Court, Justice Taney was the Chief Justice at the time. I know the Supreme Court is in the news these days. But the citizenship question they dealt with first, and they were very, very clear here that if you really want your eyebrows to catch on fire, read some Supreme Court rulings, their opinions from the early 19th century, always the beginnings of the 20th century. You would be shocked that the language used is a part of our forever record. I think you'd be very, very shocked by it. So the citizenship question. The question is simply this, the court said. Can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? One of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States in the cases specified in the Constitution. Further on, we think people of African ancestry are not, and that they are not included, and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. So, when I say that this idea of who is we was clearly defined by the Constitution and by those that interpreted the Constitution, which means our Supreme Court, this case kind of makes that point. But that's not the whole story. And remember, I use contemporary and ancient, if you will, for America. I know that's not really ancient, but ancient texts, often in concert and to militate against each other. So you have this happening in Supreme Court in 1857, but you also have Frederick Douglass is one of the most outspoken proponents of suffrage for men the same year. All men getting an opportunity to vote, not just white propertied men. Now, the court just said that he was not a citizen, yet he risked and succeeded, actually, in creating a permanent fracture with the women's suffrage movement. Remember, he was the only man invited to the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1848, Frederick Douglass. But by supporting the Civil Rights Act of 1857 publicly, he was never invited to another women's suffrage event. Just put it that way. So anyhow, let's move on to this idea of how it evolves. And I mentioned the Seneca Falls Declaration, 1848. I thought it was pretty magical. So I want you to imagine this conference. It was a women's rights convention, Seneca Falls, New York, July 19th through 20th, July 1848. They decided to rewrite the Declaration of Independence. Why do you think they rewrote the Declaration of Independence and didn't just come up with an amendment? Again, our declaration is our North Star, okay? And so if you want to change the rotation of the Earth as it relates to your rights, you have to change the constellation. You have to go back, refer to the North Star, okay? And so I'll just read a small part of that declaration. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Sound familiar? That all men and women are created equal. That they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so it goes on and basically adds women to every section of the Declaration. But they also laid out a litany of charges against men. Have you all ever heard of the rule of thumb? Okay, the rule of thumb is from Virginia, and that rule was that a man could discipline his wife with a stick so long as the diameter of that stick was no thicker than his thumb, the rule of thumb. So imagine that now. You marry someone, and you're able to discipline them like you would discipline a child. Corporal punishment is what I'm talking about. They were beating their wives. It was legal. You could beat your wife because she was property. She had no right to income she earned. Let's say she was especially skilled at making beautiful dresses. Well, she could make them all day, but her husband had a right to her salary from doing so. And so it's a very, very different time than we can imagine. And so the suffrage movement among women, and I'm not an expert there, so I won't speak too long. I will say that the 19th Amendment was a tremendous game changer for our country and also paved the way for civil rights legislation 45 to 50 years later under Lyndon B. Johnson. Great. So the Declaration of Sentiments is something you should definitely read. It is going to set your eyeballs on fire because you can't believe that was possible then. So that's 1848. Let's move forward to 1852. This is one of my favorite texts. July the 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass, What is a Slave to the 4th of July? Now, I happen to be a son of a minister, and I will put on my best Baptist minister voice here. So I want to set the stage. Frederick Douglass is the most photographed American per capita that ever existed. Meaning, for his time and for the size of the population, there were more photos of him, more photos taken of him than anyone in American history. Okay? I suspect our current president is going to challenge that record if someone cares to do the math, okay? But so he's a very famous person. It's around this time he had been a product of the abolitionist movement led by the Quaker Church. And so William Lloyd Garrison, of course, was a great abolitionist. But Mr. Garrison wanted a lot of control over what Frederick did, over what he said. And so Frederick was really starting to grate under that control. And he set off on lectures on his own. This is one of them, invited to speak to the church. So now, mind you, the greatest form of entertainment in 1852 was oratory. And people would sit for 3-4 hours at a time and listen to people like Frederick Douglass speak. Okay? These folks traveled a lot. And so when Frederick Douglass came to town to talk, he could talk about what was happening 1,000 miles away because he had come from that direction. And so it was everything in terms of entertainment at that time. It was live television. And so I want to talk just about his opening and his close, okay? But I strongly advise you, read the whole thing. It's quite something. The way he set them up, oh my gosh, he gave them a 1-2 combination like you wouldn't believe. So I want you to pay close attention to pronouns, okay? I'm going to read the opening. Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, this, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance, and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years, though a good old age for a man, is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. 70 years and 10 is the allotted time for individual men, but nations numbers their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and much hope is needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. Before I go on, what did you hear about the pronouns there? What was Frederick doing? Okay? Fellow citizens, okay? What about the religious imagery there? Speaking to the emancipated people of God, he's talking about the flight from Egypt of the ancient Jews. He's laying it on pretty thick to a religious audience who no doubt see themselves as the emancipated people of God, except it wasn't the Egyptians they emancipated themselves from. It was England, okay? but they've elevated themselves to the emancipated people of God. So this is towards the last fourth of his speech. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further upon your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it, and yet you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Oh, be warned, be warned. A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosoms. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breasts of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you this hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever. My goodness, I think Frederick Douglass had problems expressing his emotions. What do you all think? A lot going on in this closing summation. In fact, if it were at my father's church, my dad's hand would have been on the side of his head, signaling to the organist, it's time to help him tune up, all right? So catch the key that I'm speaking in and play appropriately, right? If you haven't been to a black church, you got to see this at least once. It's amazing. Great. So he talked about your national inconsistencies. What did I say earlier? North Star. To the degree to which we fail as a nation because we don't live up to our own words, the words of the founding fathers, okay? All men are created equal, as endowed by the Creator, with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all right? So he's blasting their republicanism. You remember Federalist 10? Okay? Remember James Madison is arguing for something not a direct democracy because he was afraid of the mobs? Okay? He was afraid of the factions and the passion of the people. In other words, the passion of the commoners, the unlanded. Okay? The have-nots. Does this feel familiar to you, to our current day and our wealth disparity in this country? At some point, the have-nots say, you know what? I think I'll have some of that. Not this topic, a different one. Your humanity as a base pretense and your Christianity as a lie. I think this country has prided itself for a very long time on its moral leadership. And that is lacking these days. But I think if Frederick Douglass was sitting here, he said it has never been a moral leader because of the original stain of slavery. Okay? And because when you said we, you didn't mean everybody. You meant the folks in that room, okay? But here's the beauty of this statement from 1776. We know they meant just the folks in the room. They know they meant just the people in that room. But that's not what they said. They said, we hold these truths that all men are created equal. It is really hard to reduce all to some. Now, our country has tried really hard to do it, done a pretty good job legally for a very long time. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. It talks about the involvement of our federal government in housing discrimination for the last 70 years. Interesting topic, depressing, but there's hope because we're talking about it. That's the hope. So Frederick is letting them have it. He's essentially making the same argument in 1852 that the moral power abroad is being destroyed by your inconsistent behavior at home that Malcolm X made to those newly free African republics in 1963, when he was trying to get a General Assembly meeting about American apartheid. It's also the same argument that the Russians used against the United States as they recruited those African nations, those newly free African nations. Look what they're doing to African Americans that have been in that country since the beginning. They don't believe in land of the free, home of the brave. Why on earth would you partner with them? Partner with us. Socialism is better. More on that later. He uses the word hissing here, which I thought was really, and it makes your name a hissing, a byword to a mocking earth. That is super loaded with religious imagery. What animal hisses? Snakes. Snakes hiss. What do we know about snakes and religious imagery, specifically the Garden of Eden? Okay? Right? The snake used to be able to walk. The serpent said something and convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. And as punishment, it had to slither on the earth, the very earth that mocks it for its punishment. Okay? So he just called everybody in the room a snake. He just called the entire country like, you're a snake. And then he follows it up. The same snake is nursing at the tender breasts of your young republic. To be a fly on the wall in that room 150 years ago, oh my goodness. This must have been amazing. I don't know if they threw tomatoes at him or what, but he certainly made his point. But he also forced this idea that perhaps we have to live up to our own billing. Perhaps we can't use moral power abroad if we don't have moral power home. Okay? Moreover, this speech, this sermon, is still relevant today. It's relevant to the young people in those streets right now as part of the global Black Lives Matter movement. It's relevant to this moment in our nation's history, where I call it a moral reckoning, where we're having discussions about inequity, we're having discussions about privilege, we're having discussions about things that we haven't discussed in public before. And so one could close your eyes, change the dates, and use the same words, and they would still be relevant. Now, I know that feels slow and that feels heavy. But remember what he said about 76 years being very young for a nation. China is 8,000 years old. The China that we know, 8,000 years old. Japan, 10,000 years old. Okay, France is 1,200 years old. Okay, the UK is 1,100 years old. Okay, we are young, 244 years. What's the name of this seminar? Becoming an Inclusive Republic. We are still on our way, folks. Don't give up hope. And we're back. We're still talking about how our notion of we has evolved over time. And we're in the mid to the latter half of the 19th century with Reconstruction. So immediately following the Civil War, the victorious North imposed restrictions on southern states with federal troops to ensure enfranchisement of Black voters, of these free, newly free people. They could vote for the first time ever. They could be elected for the first time ever. And things are going rather swimmingly for this newly enfranchised Black Americans. And then you had a very close election in 1876. The Compromise of 1877 happened. The outgoing Republican president, Ulysses S. Grant, the victorious general from the Civil War, removed federal troops from Florida. And Rutherford B. Hayes, the winner by compromise president, removed the remaining federal troops in South Carolina and Louisiana. By 1905, effectively every Black person was disenfranchised. Then we're talking about Black men. This is prior to 1919. So women could not vote even if they were helped by federal troops. There was no right of them to vote in 1905. But men could no longer vote. Black men could no longer vote in any southern state by 1905. So clearly, there is a moment, a hiccup, if you will, in this evolutionary arc towards inclusiveness. But you also had something interesting happen in 1896, a very, very famous Supreme Court case. This is Plessy v. Ferguson. So Mr. Plessy was of mixed descent. He was reportedly 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African American. And by appearances, he looked to be Caucasian. And he says, because I look white, I should be completely enfranchised. He was removed from a first-class train car in Louisiana where he had bought his ticket for, and was very angry about it, and pursued this case. And the court ultimately held that separate but equal. This is where that doctrine comes from. And so I call this a crack in the armor, if you will, because it's saying we can provide you with full rights. We just don't have to do it together. Okay? Now, Brown v. Board of Education in 1854 overturned this case, but for many years, decades, that this was the case. You've seen the iconic photos of the colored-only water fountains and white-only water fountains, bathroom facilities. Blacks could certainly eat at restaurants. They just had to have the food given to them out of the back door. They couldn't eat inside, but they could receive food. That was the law of the land, and especially of the South, up until, frankly, the mid-1960s. So this is well after Brown v. Board of Education. That's another topic. But again, we're talking about how our notion of we evolved. And here's where we have to go back to something Frederick Douglass said in 1852. It destroys your moral power abroad. Because what happened in the 1940s? World War II, okay? And so it was the beginning, as we were coming out of the ashes, Europe is rebuilding itself. Two powers are set up to run the world. You had Russia and you had the United States. Now, the United States was in better shape financially, didn't lose as much as in terms of soldiers, and financially didn't lose as much. In fact, it was a huge boon for our economy. In fact, from 1945 to present, we've had a world order, liberal Western democracies that have proven to be victorious economically and otherwise, defeated the old Soviet Union. Reagan is greatly credited with essentially spinning them out of existence. And the power of our economy was helped us do that. And so you have a competition in 1948 for the hearts and minds of all people in the world who desire freedom. Okay? Specifically, the Southeast Asian colonies, African colonies, Caribbean, South American colonies. People have a choice to make. Do we ally with the U.S. or do we ally with Russia or the Soviet Union at that time? And so Eleanor Roosevelt gave an incredible speech in Paris. It was, I believe, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she essentially created a paradigm that exemplified the American way, and especially its moral leadership abroad. She said, the basic problem confronting the world today, as I've said at the beginning, is the preservation of human freedom for the individual and consequently for the society of which he is a part. So then she goes on to give you a conception of what that means in her country, the United States. Now, she's giving this discussion at the United Nations. You have people in this crowd that are giving her a side eye because they know what's happening for non-white people in the United States at that time. They know that women were just given the right to vote less than 30 years before. And then only white women are voting. They're the only ones allowed to vote if their husbands let them. Okay? At that time. And so she's looking at him sideways. I don't know. What do you think? But again, when I think of North Stars, I put this in that constellation because she created a perspective, a point of view that people can refer to over and over again. Every year, every November in a non-COVID year, the Aspen Institute is at the Roosevelt House where she used to live, and we're paying tribute to this very speech, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that she gave in 1848, because of the impact that it has had on the world, on civil society especially, on the norms in which we try to attain for ourselves. It also created in the mind of the public some notion of what's right and what's wrong. I know what feels good. I know what feels right. But it's probably not a good thing for other people. Empathy, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'm talking about. Empathy. This care for your common man. And if we can give credence and support to folks outside of the United States, countries that are struggling for freedom, trying to throw away the bonds that tied them, what can we do for the person literally next door to us, the next neighborhood over, on the other side of the railroad tracks? Consistency. I will prevail not upon your national inconsistencies. Telling the words of Frederick Douglass, they're ringing. So Eleanor Roosevelt really set the stage in many ways for the letter from Birmingham jail, which we won't cover here. But literally 4 months later, Martin Luther King, the author of the letter from Birmingham jail, gave probably the most important speech in American history. In fact, I Have a Dream, as we all know, the name is actually two speeches. It was called the Bank of Justice. And all of those people that helped prepare him for this speech were really focused on making a constitutional argument. So let me set the stage for you. There are 250,000 people in the National Mall. Literally, if you've ever stood the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and if you look out towards the Washington Monument, as far as the eye can see, there's just humanity. Okay? The only thing that is visible amongst the people is the reflecting pool. But it was so hot that day that people were just sitting in the reflecting pool as well to cool off. So there's people everywhere. The steps are crowded with celebrities and security and all types of people. The night before, Martin Luther King was part of a group of moderates, including Father O'Boyle, who at the behest of John F. Kennedy talked a young John Lewis down from giving a very acerbic speech that was going to call out John F. Kennedy. Okay? So a lot of tension in this stage. Now, so Martin gets up to give his speech. He's the featured speaker. Everybody wanted to hear him. He was one of the last speakers. And he starts off with something that sounds very Frederick Douglass-like. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end their long night of captivity. So he's drawing the picture. He was excellent at this. But 100 years later, he went on, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. So we have come today to dramatize an appalling condition. Do you notice the hook 100 years later? He was amazing orator at this. It is not a lost art. Our previous president, I thought, gave perhaps the third best speech of our republic. And I say, I Have a Dream. Fourth, George Washington's Farewell, Gettysburg Address, I Have a Dream. And then his eulogy at the South Carolina Mother Emanuel Church, where he sang, it was about grace and singing Amazing Grace. I thought it was an incredible speech. If you haven't heard it, please go find it on YouTube. It's incredible. So he's talking about, 100 years, nothing has changed for the Negro. Now remember, this is 1963. So he's basically saying since the Civil War, but for that blip of the Reconstruction that we won't even mention. It was so short, there's no need to mention it. an appalling condition still continues in this land of plenty. And he goes on further. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the archetypes of this republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here, he's saying something that wasn't true. We know what they meant in 1776. But what did I say about the words? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay? It's hard to get away from all men. It's really hard. Okay? So let's go on further. So he's creating what we call in law a duty of care. Basic tort law. You have a duty of care. You breach that duty. Someone suffers damages, and you must remedy those damages. Okay? So to put this in nation state language, you have laws. You have protection of the laws. You're denying people who should have protection of those laws, protection of those laws. You have a duty. You're breaching a duty. Here's the remedy. All right? So he's laying it out. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. Why did he use banking language? First of all, the speech was called the Bank of Justice before it changed the name, and I'll tell you why it changed the name later. There were no e-checks. There wasn't digital banking. There weren't ATMs in 1963. If you had a bank account, if you had a home, if you had a loan of any kind, you signed lots of paperwork. You kept that paperwork with you at your house. Your bank kept a copy. If you wanted money from your bank, you had to go to the bank and take it out. If you wanted to deposit money, you had to go to the bank and put it in. Okay? It was a person-to-person transaction. And every adult, for the most part, knows exactly what he's saying in the promissory note. Like, they totally got it. Oh, yeah, promissory note. Somebody owes you something. Somebody promises to pay a duty of care here. So it is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this secret obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. Now, I know many of you have never seen a check, and that's fine. But in the olden days, if you wrote a check that was bad, you can go to jail for that, by the way. Right? But the bank would stamp it and it would say insufficient funds and it would return to the sender. Okay? And then that sender would come reach out and say, hey, you gave us a bad check. You need to fix this or we're calling the police for fraud. Okay? So he's saying America has given us a bad check. But we, he continued, refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. We have come here today to cash a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing pill of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now, he's painting this constitutional image, right? He's making a legal argument. But there is a famous woman to his right and behind him. Her name was Mahalia Jackson. She was a very famous gospel singer, powerful voice. Sang all over the world. She was incredible. Go find her on YouTube. Quite something. She had been with Martin on the circuit, if you will, the civil rights circuit, where they would go to church after church after church and meeting hall after meeting hall, raising money, encouraging people to continue the sit-ins, distributing money to the people who were being fired because they were participating in civil rights activities. That was a big thing, this economic boycott, just people firing you. You could no longer be their housekeeper or no longer be their driver because you dared to ask for the right to vote. That was happening all over America. And so a lot of the money being raised was, A, to support folks like Martin King and a young Jesse Jackson and Ralph Abernathy, also major stars from Muhammad Ali to Mahalia Jackson to Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr. They were also supporting the families of these civil rights heroes because these are men that were putting their lives on the line every single day. And as we know, many of them died. A lot of them died. And so she'd heard pretty much all of his rhetoric, and she was bored. Moreover, as a performer, she knew that the crowd was getting restless. And so if you listen closely to the I Have a Dream speech, it was only like 8 minutes. You can hear her bellow, "Tell him about the dream, Martin! Tell him about the dream!" So Martin King takes the speech, puts his hand on top of it, and he says, "But I still have a dream." And by doing so, the speech became one for the history books, but it inspired a nation. We call people founding fathers and founding mothers because of the actions that they took during their lifetimes changed the way we view ourselves. It changed our notion of we. From Eleanor Roosevelt getting us a modern day North Star, to the founding fathers giving us the original constellation, to Abraham Lincoln redefining what leadership in crisis looks like. Martin King so inspired Dwight D. Eisenhower that he felt empowered 6 months later to write an editorial, a national editorial called Why I Am Republican. And he laid out a civil rights vision, a vision for civil rights. And he claimed that Republicans were the originators of it because they were the party of Lincoln. He wrote that to blunt the force of one Goldwater. Goldwater was on a path to winning the Republican nomination. He was the original nativist, okay? It would have been bad. Some would say it's bad now. I'm not ready to say that. What's more, he gave air cover to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who the very next year, about 6 months, all this happened within 6 months, wrote civil rights legislation. He got civil rights legislation through Congress, okay? Now, you should read how LBJ was able to do that. It was an any means necessary type of move. Trust me. All right? But it changed American history. Martin King, by combining these two speeches and the inspiration that ensued, did two things. One, by using the language of promissory notes and of the Bank of Justice, he transported everyone who was not intended in the original notion of we in 1776 to that room. So literally, rhetorically, everyone who wasn't intended to be part of we hold these truths to be self and all men are created equal were transported in time. Now, LBJ solidified it with the Civil Rights Act and then the next year, the Voting Rights Act. What language do you think he used in his signing statement? He used Martin King's language. And this is why I say Martin King, Eleanor Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, they are also founding fathers and mothers of this great constitutional republic. This is probably one of the most important speeches for reasons that had very little to do with the words, but the context in which those words were used. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the last part. We've talked about how our notion of we have expanded, and now we're going to talk about more contemporary things in the next section. See you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the last part of our time together, and I think this is the most important part for a variety of reasons. Where do we go from here? Okay, we've talked about our evolutionary path as a nation. This notion that we are getting better with every generation of leaders. But we are at a very interesting time in our nation's history. Now, if you listen to Strauss-Howell's generational theory of change, they said that every 80 to 90 years in the United States of America, the fifth generation, if you will, considering generation is 20 years, rises up to fix the mistakes of the previous four. If 1932 was the last great generational change, we are right on time 88 years later here in 2020. So I can't imagine a circumstance where you have five major crises happening simultaneously. I happen to think that liberal democracy is under siege, that she will survive. And by liberal democracy, I'm speaking to a form of government. I'm not talking about politics, but the form of government. Liberal democracy meaning the belief in individual rights, which is what we and our European and Australian and several other countries around the world hold dear. But these five crises that are causing stress, you have obviously COVID, the reason why this is a digital course and not us at Kane Hall, having a discussion in a large lecture room seated right next to each other. You have an economic crisis, that just instability economically, probably more so because of a partial economic shutdown. We shut the entire world down for 3 months. Surely there will be some negative consequences of that. You also have climate change. I am not one that looks at science and considers my personal beliefs to be superior. I happen to remember as a teenager in Washington State, the grass never turning brown. But in 2010, the grass started turning brown. It started burning. So in my lifetime, I saw a pretty major difference in climate and probably one of the most temperate places in the country, in Washington State. We also have demographic shifts, and I don't think this is something that should be discounted. This concern from some sections of the country, the South, the Midwest, that globalism is going to bring in or is bringing in too much demographic change, too much differences, too much diversity. And there's some concern that the majority culture, Americans of European extract, will lose power, lose influence, lose opportunities. And then lastly, emerging technologies. You all are digital natives, so you don't know what it's like not to have smartphones. I marvel at my teenager who has never seen a phone that was attached to a wall. We saw one in a museum. It was part of an exhibit, and she didn't know what it was. And I kept saying, the phone there. And she was like, no, the phone is in my pocket. I'm like, no, the phone there, that thing with the cord. She says, why on earth would you ever have a phone on the wall? And I just smiled because I used to have a phone on the wall with a 50-foot cord so I can go in my room down the hall and talk on the phone in privacy. So there's a lot of people in our country that are feeling left behind. They feel the world is evolving too quickly. There's a lot that are concerned for a variety of reasons, not just the five that I mentioned. But those five, those broad categories, I think are what's driving a lot of the animus that we are sensing around us. But the savior in this circumstance is more discourse, not less. And I'm not talking about social media. This is not something we can like. This is not something we can amen from a distance, from behind our screens. We actually have to engage each other, human to human. We have to exercise empathy. We have to listen to people and not listen to respond, but listen to understand. There's a lot that we can do. But I keep returning to this idea of loss, and I want to turn your attention to Hillbilly Elegy. It was written by J.D. Vance, and it was about his Appalachian upbringing. And it talked about a segment of the population, very patriotic, that feels left behind. Now, I know there are some that say, so what? You're poor in Appalachia. Move. It's not that easy for some people. Some people feel really tied to places where their ancestors grew up. But I can't get over this feeling of loss. And I see the loss in two ways that are super relevant. One is loss of privilege. So I want you to put your empathy hats on for a second here. And let's all imagine that we are upper middle class white families. No, fine. Let's do lower middle class white families. Where, as W.E. Du Bois said, the only thing we have going for us is the psychic benefit of knowing that as a white person in America, we will have opportunity to succeed. We will have the benefit of the doubt to get a job. My children will not be accosted by the police. They're going to receive the benefit of the doubt. That isn't something that I would give up. A rational person would not give that up just out of self-protection. Surely we can understand that, right? The other loss, this notion of complete justice. There's a lot of talk about reparations. There's a lot of people in the streets right now reacting to the Breonna Taylor case, forgetting this idea of qualified immunity that all police enjoy in this country. They want people to go to jail. They want an eye for an eye. You did this to me, so I do something to you. You took from me, so you have to give something back to me. I challenge that the following way. In the last 244 years of our national career, the United States of America, how many examples, besides the two that I mentioned, Abraham Lincoln and the Japanese internment camp, I'm sorry, I didn't mention, I'm mentioning it now, Japanese internment camp survivors received, I think, $30,000 for all surviving ones. This is under the George H.W. Bush administration, I believe. So late 80s, maybe 89, something like that. How many other examples do you know of America giving back any ill-gotten gain? Especially really big gains. I'm waiting. I just don't see it. First of all, thankfully, we are all of mixed heritage now. So how does one even qualify for reparations? I don't know. Secondly, administratively, it's just really challenging. What exactly is reparations? What is it? Who qualifies? There's a lot to think about here, okay? Are my African neighbors not eligible even though we look alike? Because I'm 8 generations deep in the U.S., and they're first generation? Surely they're being discriminated against. I don't know. That's hard. I just don't see it. So there's twin losses here. This loss of complete justice is not going to happen, in my opinion. And the loss of privilege, which is something that people will be forced to give up because of demographic change. Okay? And so both losses are relevant. They mean something to the people that feel like they're losing. So the question is, how do we contend with those losses? I have a solution. We need to hug this one out. There are some things in life we have to let go in order to move forward. I think about Nelson Mandela here. Nelson Mandela, when he was released from prison, after 27 years, he became president. The big concern is that there would be bloodshed in Africa, that the African majority would exact punishment for the 100 plus years of apartheid to the Afrikaners, the Dutch that brutalized them for 100 years. Many thousands of people left. They left their property. They left everything they knew because they were fearful. And Mandela, by not allowing that to happen, by leading, saying, listen, we're going to get over this. We're going to do truth and reconciliation. You're going to tell the truth and you will not be punished. But you're going to tell the truth. We're going to hug and we're going to sing the national anthem and we're going to go home as a nation. That is what America needs. That is why becoming an inclusive republic was created. So you have the power. Now, you could take a rope to the neck of George Washington and pull that statue down. But what good would that accomplish? That's not a process. That's not a thoughtful thing. Use civil discourse to evaluate the legacy of George Washington. Okay? Use text. Think about him in the context of his time, in the context of morality. Use that. It's not a fair mechanism to say you did something that I see in my 21st century eyes as wrong. Therefore, you got to go. We won't venerate you anymore. Now, I did this exercise recently for Dwight D. Eisenhower. As I mentioned, I'm an Eisenhower Fellow. And of the 2,000 fellows around the world, we wanted to have a relevant conversation about a person that we venerate. We call ourselves Eisenhower Fellows. But who was Eisenhower really? So I spent about 2 weeks investigating his civil rights legacy. Here's what I determined, based on reading cabinet memos and internal office memos. There's a lot of records of former presidents. It's pretty awesome, actually, for a sleuth. He wanted a much more aggressive civil rights bill in 1956. His opponents, were LBJ and a young John F. Kennedy, who didn't want to antagonize Southern senators. Eisenhower didn't care. Remember, he's the one who sent in the 104th Airborne to enforce desegregation in Little Rock. Okay? Now, that's one slice of his legacy. He's also a huge proponent of covert warfare. He gave the green light to kill Patrice Lumumba because he was socialist in the Congo. Gave the green light to take down the Shah of Iran. We're still dealing with that decision. Okay? So if you look at any leader, look at yourselves. Are you completely consistent? Do you stand by that tweet you sent 6 years ago as a teenager? I doubt it. So when I talk about empathy and the importance of civil discourse, I'm talking about the way we treat ourselves. We see ourselves as complex people. We have to see the folks that are venerated before us as complex people. Now, I'm not saying that everyone deserves to stay in our hearts and minds as great people. I think Andrew Jackson was the worst person that ever lived in the United States of America. Any trace of him should be torn down. Okay? But I don't think it's right for Cordell and his opinionated self to tear down statues, to speak poorly of him publicly. My job, I have the power of the pen. I can write something. I can prove my point. I can force folks to engage in dialogue. And that is what I'm encouraging of all of you. Engage in dialogue. I'll close on this note. John Lewis just passed. He was an amazing person. His evolution from a toughened activist whose skull was cracked on multiple occasions, who was so purposeful and so knowledgeable about the power of the media that he would wear a light-colored trench coat to the Pettus March Bridge, knowing that his face would be bloodied and the trench coat would allow the blood to be seen by the cameras. Evolved to a person that got pushed out by the Black Power movement. Okay? When James Meredith was shot on his march to desegregate the University of Alabama in 1966, Stokely Carmichael took over the march. Those last 50 miles. And when he reached the campus was the first time he started saying Black Power. Okay? So Malcolm X was killed a year before, in 65. And so you take the Ballad of Bullet, his great speech, where you should all listen on YouTube, combine that with with Black Power, the cry of the Southern student nonviolent movement, John Lewis felt out of sorts because he was with MLK and the nonviolence, and these young people, this faction, if you will, they just weren't having it. So he was pushed out. And what did he do when he was pushed out? He went to work for the Field Foundation in New York. Then he went to work for President Carter. He built knowledge, skill, savvy as a leader of small nonprofit programs, as an administrator of national programs. It powered his run for the Atlanta City Council, and then to his place in history in the U.S. House as the moral voice of our country. Now, had he gone with Stokely and turned and said, let's tear it all down, let's burn it all down, would he have got what he received from evolving? I'm going to say no. I don't think you would have the type of send-off he received, this great humanitarian that he evolved to be as an 80-year-old, had he stayed stuck in a 23-year-old mind. And so I want us all to be mindful of the fact that just like we evolved as human beings, our nations evolved. And frankly, that fact is what powers my optimism and my ability as a Black man in America to empathize with white Appalachians who feel that a loss of privilege is a threat to their own humanity. So I trust that you all will find some encouragement from this idea that we are a work in progress, that perhaps in our lifetimes we'll get to see the promised land like John Lewis did, and that we will make each institution we touch better for us having been there. I thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Cordell Carter, it's so good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
You are an alum from the UW Seattle campus, and you know who our community is in this class. We've got close to 600 students now. So you graduated in 1998. Reflect on your experience as a student, Cordell. In your words, you came in not as well prepared as you had hoped, and you left a scholar. Talk about how that happened.
Yeah, I remember that first year really struggling. I'm first in my family to go to college. I remember being very disappointed with my empirical result. All the other facets of my humanity were reaffirmed here. So a loving environment in the mid-90s, met some amazing people, lifelong friends, but I just wasn't scoring as well. And I was very concerned as I was, those core classes were really kicking my rear end. And I began to lean upon the resources that were available. At that time, you had OMAD at Instructional Center, the ICC, we had advisors, and they literally pulled me up and got me on track. And it was a fantastic experience, but still something else was missing. I was sitting in class, I remember the history class, and people were making references to things I didn't understand. They were speaking about characters in books I hadn't read. And I had to go talk to some people and says, like, I'm keeping up, but there's references I'm not following. And so I had a second education. It was concurrently. I remember I found a gentleman named Roger Soder. And Roger gave me a different reading list than was in my classes. And I would go upstairs to Suzzalo. He found me a carol, and I would read at night all the things that I didn't read as a younger student. And I still reference the Peloponnesian War. I still reference that Milosian dialogue to this day. And I'm so thankful for all those amazing people that helped me become a scholar.
Roger was an incredible mind and a beautiful mind that you met who mentored you. We also had a mutual friend and mentor in Deborah Friedman, who would become
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
At UW Tacoma. You took classes with Deborah, if I recall.
I sure did. Sure did.
She left quite a legacy at Tacoma.
She sure did. She had an incredible effect on me. I remember having to get in a fetal position when I heard that she was sick. Just such an incredible presence that was leaving us, and that was really sad. And I was fortunate to take classes with her, more importantly, be mentored by her. There were some early career decisions I made because of Deborah telling me, Cordell, if I were you, I would do this. And I took that seriously. And I'm very thankful for having met her.
Her legacy lives on at UW and all of our campuses. So let's get to your talk, Cordell. I was really just fascinated and enjoyed it. You declare and you make it clear that your father's a minister at a Black church.
Yes.
And it's pretty common for Black ministers to say, wait, I'm going somewhere with this. I'm going. So you were going somewhere with your talk, and you started out with a declaration of your love of country, love of the United States, and love and hope for the United States. Why was that important for you to declare your love for this country?
Well, it's a realization that we are part of an evolutionary process, right? And once I figured out what MLK figured out in April of 1968, is that he wouldn't see the change he was fighting for in his lifetime, but collective efforts would get us there. It was like a weight being lifted off of me. And so I can sit here and rail against what's not going right, but I would rather spend my time reflecting on what's going well and the progress that has been made, and honor the sacrifice of those folks who have gone before me. And frankly, give a quiet golf applause to the country that's trying to get this thing right. There are countervailing forces, I know that, but I still believe, as a world traveler, I travel a lot, or I used to before COVID, there are a lot of places that envy what we have. And what we have isn't great all the time, but it's better than most. And that's not a question of exceptionalism. I don't think our process is any different than what other country that's far older than us have gone through. It's just an argument for the realization of just being incredibly lucky. I was born in the late 70s, Black man in America. That was the best time in the history of America to be a Black man. And I'm very thankful for that, knowing just the tremendous opportunities I've received over my 40 some odd years, and hopeful that these things will continue in the future.
You were in China for the 2016 presidential election, and you saw that as significant. You were somewhat surprised, but tell me why that was significant for you personally.
Well, personally, every question that was being asked of me of my peers during those 6 weeks in China that fall was, who's going to win the election? Who did I think was going to win? And I said, well, I think Senator or Secretary Clinton's going to win. And I would give reasons for it, and they would shake their head and says, no, Donald Trump is going to win. And I said, why? They said, people like strong people. I said, well, that may be the case in your system, but in my system, it's a little different. And so to see the result go a way I didn't expect, and then literally getting texts on WeChat from people saying, because I said, hey, if he wins, I'm going to immigrate to China. And I thank you in advance for a job. And they would say, hey, welcome to China. Literally sent just chills up my spine because I didn't know the country I thought I did. And then seeing the protests in the street, I'm like, wait a minute, friend. Your opportunity to protest was at that voter's booth. And the fact that you don't get that is a problem. Not the electoral result, but you not understanding the role that you play in our democratic system.
You titled your talk, Becoming an Inclusive Republic. Part of the premise is that we don't have a strong enough civics education, and you start with three questions that are kind of three-dimensional, looking back, looking at the present, and looking at the future. Who is we? How has we evolved? And where do we go from here? Talk about the title, and why did you choose Becoming an Inclusive Republic? Why was that important for you?
Well, becoming is an action verb, and we are in the midst of evolution. We are a very different place than we were in 1789, than in 1850, than in 1950. Frankly, we're a different place than we were in 2000. So we are still in the process of becoming that beloved community that many civil rights veterans would talk about, they would sing about and dream about. But we're also a very different place in the founders' intent. They were banking on a a coastal country, much like Mother Europe, that was just these colonies around the coast. The French were to your immediate left, and then you had the wild country far, far as the eye can see on the other side. They didn't imagine a sea from shining, a continent that was sea to shining sea. That wasn't, we don't have a system that was built for the country that we have. That's number one, right? So these are things that we have to fix. And so the three questions, this idea of becoming something and who is we, that's about the conversation we have with the text, okay? Every country has a North Star. It could be an event, a liberating event. You know, you think of some of the African republics, and the reason why these strong men stayed in so long, because they were the literal North Star. They liberated the country from their colonizers after years and years of abuse. In our country, we have a document. It's called, and it's a non-binding legal document, but it's something that's referred to every single day. That's a Declaration of Independence, right? So let's have a conversation with the text. That's number one. Number two, how has our notion of we evolved? That's a conversation with our peers. That society determines what we is at any point in time. It's all about context. And that last question, where do we go from here? That's a conversation with yourself. Mm-hmm. That's a three-part conversation.
The three-part conversation. So you start us with the Declaration of Independence. You call that the North Star, and cite the first few lines of the Declaration of Independence, because that has meaning to you. Yeah. And it somewhat defines who we are and who we are not.
Indeed. You know, you think about the people in that room, and I think about the Hamilton, you know, the room where it happens. And I always get folks to talk about what's in that room, who was in that room, because the words mean something different when they say that. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What does self-evident mean? Where does that come from? That all men are created equal. You know how revolutionary that was to say when you are a nobleman of King George in 1776, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, meaning things that cannot be availed against. Think about the words of St. Peter. Upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's where unalienable comes from. That among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These are revolutionary ideas. I mean, this is literally a crazy person on the public square screaming into the madness, and people are like dismissing him. Get out of here. That's not reality. But that's what they did in that room. And that was the rallying cry for that faction to take down a world power.
Pursuit of happiness. Why happiness as opposed to freedom or as opposed to something else? Why is happiness important?
It's interesting you asked that question, and it goes to, that's an economic issue, because the original word was not happiness. The original word was property, because this goes back to who's in the room. The people in that room were propertied noblemen. They had the right to land because King George said, if you can tame the land, meaning rid it of its inhabitants, you can have it. And you claim it in the name of England, and you pay me tribute for the right to conquer that land. So everyone in that room derived income, i.e. happiness, from land, from property. But Benjamin Franklin thought the word property was alienating to the 99.5% of the people that were actually in the colonies. They didn't have land. Okay, they were blacksmiths, they were tradesmen, they were laborers. Many of them were indentured servants that were working off the fee to transport them from the old country to the new. And so if you say this is only property owners, no one else is, why would they fight England for you? This is your fight, not ours. But happiness? Oh, we all get that. Everyone wants to be happy, right? No one wants to be under the boot of someone else. And so he chose an inclusive word to get more people to fight against King George.
So the Declaration of Independence frames who we are. This gets tested in 1857 when Dred Scott, who is of African descent, and his wife and his two daughters, I believe, they want to be included. And so they sue the United States to be inclusive. Do rights include Dred Sam Scott? What do we learn from the Dred Scott case, and why do you include that so powerfully here?
Well, you know, you're 80 years after the Constitution. And at this point, the legislature, for the answers they couldn't provide through legislation, the Supreme Court was deciding in. And in fact, Justice Taney, I believe this is Justice Taney's court, was very strident in his belief that the third pillar of the federal government had a a big role to play in the interpretation of founders' intent. And so the very first question of that decision was, can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country, sold as slaves, become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and by which fall heir to all the rights and privileges of citizenship? The court said no. Okay, they were clearly defining who was we, and you're not included if you're of African descent. Now, this is a very consequential decision for Dred Scott personally, but also for the country, because he was in, I believe, Kansas at the time, and so that Kansas was a territory. It wanted to be a state. The South wanted more slave states. Okay, the North did not. So by rendering this decision the way they did, it caused, I should say, ignited a lot of the political animus that was already going on, and exploded in 1861 into our most deadliest conflict, the Civil War.
In 1848, the very language that anchored the Declaration of Independence is held up and held right back to the United States at the first Women's Rights Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton uses the very same lines from the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. What is she doing here?
She made it an inclusive document, and she replaced the pitfalls of royalty with the pitfalls of domination by men. And so she says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator, and on and on. And then, as the Declaration, the original Declaration, lays out all of these charges against King George for reasons why they should rebel, she did the same thing against men. And she was being really, really clear. Now, the context of 1848 is that women were considered dependents, just a little above children of men. She didn't have a right to her own income. She could be disciplined, physically disciplined by her husband, so long as the instrument that he used to discipline wasn't wider than the diameter of his thumb, therefore the rule of thumb. And so it's a very, very hostile environment for women. They were most certainly were not part of the we, and for people of African descent. We know they weren't part of the we.
You spent some time really taking us through an orating, July 5th, 1852, Frederick Douglass. Your celebration, your 4th of July celebration is a sham.
Sham, yes.
Talk about the power of Frederick Douglass at this time and this notion of who's included in the we and what work he's trying to do.
So Frederick Douglass was the most famous American of his day. He was, per capita, the most photographed person in American history for the population size. Oratory was the main form of entertainment. There wasn't popular music outside the church for the most part. There was obviously no television or radio. You played with an iron wheel with a stick. Maybe you kicked a sack around. There was no NBA. There was no basketball. These things weren't created yet. So what you did was listen to the most educated people among you. These were your orators. They often appeared at churches or at large assembly halls. And people would sit and listen or stand and listen. And so by him coming into town to deliver this Independence Day speech, he did two things. One is he perfected the art of othering. He wanted to clearly lay out the cognitive dissonance that was prevailing in the country at the time, a country purporting to be a Christian nation, right? And celebrating, we were celebrating the independence of this country from an oppressive force known as England. Now, this is 40 years after the War of 1812, when England tried to take back the United States. By the way, you should listen to the third verse of the Star Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key wrote that as he was watching African slaves destroy the White House. Okay, it'll surprise you. Look at all the verses of the Star Spangled Banner, which I've sang many times at baseball games. Go figure, right? So Frederick Douglass uses the language of Christianity, the story of deliverance, to eviscerate the United States of America. There's some parts and then he used pronouns. He says, this to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. So he's literally taken the United States of America and put them under Pharaoh's thumb. Okay. Pharaoh was King George. You've been liberated and God made it happen for you. So you can imagine the folks, they're feeling really good about themselves. They're probably wondering, why is he using such weird pronouns? He said fellow citizens, then he goes back to you. Why does he? That's interesting. And then he gets to the tune-up part. This is what, in a Black church, this is when the preacher's about to end. He's about 15 minutes or so. He starts to speak in a sing-songy way so the organist knows which key to play to follow him. It's great. I wish I had an organist here. But he says, fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further upon your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. These are fighting words, okay? He said this in a church, in a pulpit, with religious people who led the abolitionist movement. So it's no wonder that he and William Lloyd Garrison stopped getting along. First of all, Frederick was far more famous, okay? He was carrying the movement himself. But secondly, he's calling out the very people that, quote unquote, helped liberate him, okay? But the part about the hissing is what really gets me. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. He's literally calling the United States of America the serpent that was cursed by God in the Garden of Eden. I can't tell you how this hit the audience. I can't imagine it was fun for them. But there's a good reason why this speech is quoted every 4th of July.
Yep. You draw a through line from Frederick Douglass, 1852, Malcolm X in 1963, who declared 1964, an election year, the ballot or the bullet. This is LBJ and Barry Goldwater. And you draw a through line to the Black Lives Matter movement. So we go from Frederick Douglass to Malcolm X and the Black Lives Matter movement. You see those as connected in some way.
I do, because it's again, speaking to the cognitive dissonance. And I think one of the things that is truly exceptional about this country is that you can live in two different realities, that you literally, because of the power of segregation, and I must say government-sponsored segregation, you can, there's no racism. Nobody's racist here. What are you talking about? We're good. Now, I may not happen to have Black neighbors, but maybe they haven't worked hard enough to earn enough to live in this neighborhood. Or, I have Latino neighbors. And so it becomes this very interesting reality for folks who they just don't understand it. And this is why I think our greatest Americans were those northern kids that came down for the summers of 61 and 60 and 62 for the Freedom Summers, because those kids lived an alternate reality. They could have had those same justice-minded views and became hippies like their older brothers and sisters a few years later, but they put their actual bodies on the line as human shields to ride down in the South against those windows, knowing that the KKK and the police were waiting for them at the border and were going to brutalize them. They said, but if I'm brutalized on television, the world can't deny what's going on here, okay? And so you look at the BLM movement and what they're calling out in the streets. They're saying, we have to deal with this. We will never get to be this exceptional place unless we deal with it. Same with Malcolm X. He said, listen, either we're going to be a country or this is just going to be John Locke, nasty, brutal, and short. You might as well grab a gun. It's the ballot or the bullet. Frederick Douglass saying, you are not Christians. You're hardly a country. You have to recognize what's going on here. It's the same conversation over 150 years.
Cordell, you draw another line between Eleanor Roosevelt and her Universal Declaration of Human Rights as she sets the stage, in your words, for Martin Luther King at the Washington Monument in front of 250,000 people in 1963. Talk about Eleanor Roosevelt's influence of Martin Luther King in your mind. Then I want to talk about MLK in that speech.
Yeah, so Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the most remarkable women that has just ever been in public life here in the country. Considering her time, her leadership during her time, she was really being courageous. We often are looking at past historical figures. Take, Eisenhower, and you say, well, I don't know if we should venerate his name because he wasn't a leader on racial justice, right? So, how do you actually evaluate the legacy of someone that lived before you were born? You have to see what were they in relation to their peers. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was head and shoulders above her peers, okay? So much so that it is she going to Paris in the 1940s to not only express the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but to express the ideals of Western civilization. Okay? This was right in the thick of the beginning of the Cold War, where the lines of demarcation are being set. And she was saying, well, this is what the West is about. Okay, I'll leave it to Khrushchev to come up with what the East is about. But this is what the West is about. So she basically added another North Star to the constellation created by the Declaration of Independence. So MLK saying, listen, I'm going to just throw back her words at you and show the dissonance between her words and your actions. And so, again, very, very helpful to a movement that ultimately changed the country.
I'm glad you added the story about Martin Luther King and what started out as a Bank of Justice talk and became I Have a Dream, that turns at some point during the speech, because Mahalia Jackson is in the background telling a young Martin Luther King, tell him about the dream. You talk about what you think are the 5 best speeches of all times. I Have a Dream, or the Bank of Justice, George Washington's Farewell, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln, and Obama's eulogy on race at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina. Those are the 4 speeches, and I think he may have added a 5th.
I would add Obama's eulogy of John Lewis in July of 2020.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Those you think are the most influential speeches of all time?
I do. I mean, think about what has really moved the country to do something different. We can say legislation. I quibble with that. Legislation without the actual physical force of law to enforce it is meaningless. But we're still fighting for the hearts and minds of Americans. Remember what America is. It's not a physical thing. It's an idea. Okay? And these speeches have forced us to imagine ourselves in this idyllic place. George Washington walking away peacefully after doing his 2 terms created the idea that presidents should only serve 2 terms. It was a North Star as it relates to presidents. Okay, Abraham Lincoln, with his very, very short Gettysburg Address speech, following an incredibly vicious battle in Pennsylvania, set the stage for our notion of presidential empathy. Okay, Martin Luther King's speech on the steps, and I say Martin plus Mahalia Jackson because that assists change history. Okay, his speech forced all of America to rethink their notion of the American dream. Okay, who are we as people? Period. Yes, I want my kids to be judged on something other than their skin color. Yes, I want that. Okay, and that forced LBJ's hand. Okay. Obama's eulogies, unfortunately, both these speeches are eulogies. He was a gifted orator, but we remember these eulogies because he expressed the pain of the country and the disbelief and the exasperation. You recall at the end of that speech, he just started singing Amazing Grace. And the entire crowd of 20,000 in that stadium, the temperature just changed. And it went from this awful, crazy thing has happened again, a mass shooting in America, unprovoked, people praying, to, you know what? There is redemption possible for everyone. If you recall, those families forgave that young man who killed their family members. And then his very incredible eulogy of John Lewis, most recently, set the stage for, I should say, it created in our minds the ideal life, a life well lived. He's one of the few from his generation of civil rights leaders that actually got to be an old man. Most of them were killed. Okay, and so you want to what is a just reward for a life of sacrifice? I would think it's someone like Obama, someone like Bill Clinton, these former presidents speaking about what you contributed to America and your elevation to a modern day founding father.
The word empathy comes up throughout your talk, and it's come out throughout this conversation, Cordell. And you call out in your talk, because I want to be clear about this, you say that there are 5 crises of 2020, because we're now in 2020. You've moved us from founding documents to now. COVID-19 is one. The economic crisis, the ensuing economic crisis. Climate change. Demographic shifts that you call out that are shaping who we is. Emerging technologies. And you've said to me that you didn't really call out race because the need for racial reconciliation is self-evident in your mind. But you use the words self-evident. You didn't say that in your tweet, but you said it just to me recently. Why is that self-evident, and what are we going to do about the dilemmas that we find ourselves in right now?
We are 244 years old. If we don't know by now that that there are different realities for our fellow Americans, then we have some type of mental disease. It's purposeful at this point. Okay, we have empirical evidence that the life chances of Black people, of Latino people, are different than white people. Okay, there's a problem if you refuse to accept some things that are empirically true. The fact that we even have a discussion on what is true and what isn't, that we deny science, is a mental disease. It really is. And frankly, it's something that could end us all. And so when I say it's self-evident, this gets back to that conversation with yourself that I was laid out at the beginning. You have to figure out why heckles are raised anytime someone speaks a reality that's different from yours. There's something wrong with you that won't accept their reality, that cannot empathize with their plight. And so that's what I meant by self-evident, that these things, we have to deal with them or we'll never get to this next stage. We'll always be at each other for some odd reason and easily exploitable. I never imagined we would make the jobs of our enemies so simple by being simpletons as it relates to national unity. But that's where we are. And so you look at the current generation and the things that they have encountered, those 5 crises, of course, that are existential in their nature, but they've seen 2 recessions. Most were probably very little as toddlers doing 9/11, major terrorist attack. This is the most battle-tested generation in probably since World War II, the baby boomers. And so I suspect that there'll be another greatest generation for the following reason. Every 4 or 5 generations in American history, so this is 80 to 90 years, that 5th generation in that cycle changes the next generation in a way and changes the country in a way that is far closer to our democratic ideals, far closer to our North Star than the previous 4. And so we've essentially have these 70-something-year-olds, these baby boomers that have bankrupted us, okay? They went from hippie, free love to like everything belongs to me and I'm never leaving my job. All right. And so this is the environment that we find ourselves in. And we're looking for the young people that are entering college right now to lead the charge for the next 100 years. And so we've given them a really, really bad hand to play. And they have to play it. This is the converse. Where do we go from here? This is on you. Okay, you can vote. You can join these organizations. You can get active. There's a lot of things that you can do that frankly have nothing to do with the folks that are actually leading now.
I'm going to give the final word to you, Cordell, that you believe, you are hopeful that we will get to a place of truth and reconciliation and healing. And you have hope that we will be the inclusive republic that we intended to be. Tell the students why you're optimistic about all of that.
We are a country of believers, okay? Whether you believe in God or believe in the idea of America, whatever your belief is, but we have very strong beliefs. And I believe that there are a majority of us that believe that America can be this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-pluralistic society that makes history as being a peaceful place where power and wealth are shared equitably across the board. That is the future that we're heading to, one way or the other. Either we're going to share it or it'll be taken, okay? And so the hope that I have is that folks don't want war. It's not profitable for anyone. We don't want to destroy ourselves. We actually want to prove our doubters wrong. that we believe that we are an exceptional people living in exceptional times. And so I'm hopeful that that American sense of ingenuity and entrepreneurship will lead us to a place where, listen, I can't fix everything that's wrong, but I can tell you the truth. This is why I believe the things I believe. Now, I'm going to listen to you as you tell me that my beliefs are wrong. And I'm going to listen here with respect. We're going to shake hands. We're going to hug it out. We're going to sing the national anthem and leave this room as Americans. And that is what has to have that reconciliation. It has to happen across the board at every level for us to get past this current moment.
Cordell Carter, thanks for giving our students hope.
Thank you, Ed.